Hey guys, how's it going? Matthew Kadish here, author of the Earthman Jack Space Saga and editor-in-chief at thedailygeekery.com, the number one news site for everything I find interesting. Anyway, today I want to talk about a little thing that happened on Twitter recently, which is basically for my Roundtable Reviews podcast, which some of you might know is the podcast where I basically bring on two guests and we break down different movies and TV shows and stuff like that from a writing slash storytelling perspective. And, we just analyze different types of films that I enjoy, films that I think are interesting to look at in terms of like analysis and breaking them down and stuff like that. And recently, in preparation for a recording coming up, this Saturday at the time of this recording, I rewatched Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. And not only did I rewatched it twice. I watched the extended Ultimate Edition, which is 3 hours long. And then I went and watched the theatrical cut, which is 2.5 hours long. So the Ultimate Edition basically added 30 minutes worth of story. And I watched both of them back to back, basically so I could compare and contrast and, kind of see what was left out. Because I had seen Batman v Superman in the theater when it came out, and I remember having a very mixed reaction to it. It wasn't nearly as good as I had hoped it would be. I didn't hate it, but I was very kind of meh about it. And once the Ultimate Edition became available on streaming, I bought that, I downloaded it, and I watched it. And it did do a better job of kind of clearing up some of the more muddy subplots in the movie, but it didn't actually make it a better movie overall, in my opinion. It was still just kind of meh. And in preparation for this podcast, whenever I take a movie that we're going to do a roundtable review on, I sit down, I really analyze it, watch it, pay attention, take notes, and come up with discussion questions to, engage with the guests about. And I really try to, do a thorough job of analyzing the movie when I'm preparing for these podcasts. And when it came to Batman versus Superman, before, I had seen it 3 times before then. And I'd probably say that, I felt like it was a decent movie. It wasn't the greatest superhero movie ever made, but I didn't think it was terrible. But I had a really hard time watching it for this podcast because I was being so analytical about it and so critical. All these issues that the movie has just kept popping out to me, and it made it really hard to watch the film. I had to stop it and start it numerous times just because I'd be getting bored, or I just need to take a break because I just found it so overwhelming because there were so many issues with the film, in my opinion. And I went on Twitter just to kind of do what I do on Twitter, which is tweet about stuff that I'm doing and that I'm interested in, and and I basically said, wow, I don't remember Batman v Superman being this bad. It's way harder to get through than it should be. And I put it out there as a throwaway tweet. I didn't really think anything about it because I talk about movies and TV shows I'm watching on Twitter all the time. And boy, oh boy, did I get dogpiled on by the Cult of Zack Snyder. Basically, every Snyder fan in the Twitterverse somehow found this tweet and just jumped down my throat about me daring to be critical about this movie that they like. And I don't fault people for liking a certain type of movie or whatever. If people think that Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice is a masterpiece, more power to them. I'm looking at it from a different perspective than just a casual fan or a casual moviegoer or even a comic book fan. I'm looking at it from the perspective of someone who's a professional writer, and I'm analyzing it from that perspective. And so the issues that I found by and large with this movie were very much story issues. The movie technically is quite well done. I think the cinematography is really good. The action is very well staged. The acting, for the most part, is good with a few exceptions. So there are good aspects to the movie, but the story to me is always the thing that carries a movie through and helps it stand the test of time. And I feel like Batman v Superman just had so many issues with its story that, I just found a hard time enjoying it. And part of what we were going to talk about on the podcast were all the numerous story issues that, the movie has. And the Cult of Snyder, as I like to call them, all the Snyder fans out there who I really underestimated in terms of their rabid, defense of all things Snyder and his DC comic stuff, really came at me. And some people, were, really interested in engaging in debate about the film. They wanted to ask my opinion about it, kind of get a clear idea of why I thought it was bad, and then they'd offer their counterpoint. And we'd have some good debate on this Twitter thread. And I really appreciated that. But for the most part, I'd say like 80% of the responses I got were just really toxic and mean-spirited and, just not very nice. And I kind of wanted to go through some of my favorite ones here just to kind of show you guys, number one, what I was going up against on this Twitter thread, but number two, to also kind of like just illustrate some of the issues I've had with film criticism. And I've dealt with this with my criticism of The Last Jedi as well, where you get super fans of these movies who seem completely blinded by brand loyalty or loyalty to a certain type of filmmaker or what have you. And they just get very, very, what's the word? Vitriolic in their defenses of it. But, to each their own. I really do appreciate all the attention I got off of this tweet thread. But I wanted to kind of cover some of these tweets in this video, just because I think it's kind of funny in a certain respect. So here's the first tweet that we got. Even from a narrative point of view, it's not poorly written in regards to Batman vs. Superman. All it asks you to do is pay attention to it. It's literally all you have to do. Pay attention. If that's not your thing, cool, great. But that you, not the movie. There's no such thing as a bad movie, just a bad audience. All right. First of all, this idea that there's a bad audience, I do not agree with at all. You got to keep in mind that as a storyteller, you're telling your story to an audience. You're gearing it towards a specific type of person to be consumed. So you cannot blame your audience for not liking your movie or your story. That's just completely ignorant in terms of, what a storyteller's job is. As a storyteller, you're meant to engage and entertain your audience. That's the proper thing that storytellers have to do. So if you have a big majority of your audience who are critical of your story or didn't like your story or it didn't connect with them the way it should have, you did something wrong as a storyteller. Now, I paid attention to this movie very closely, and that's why I was able to pick out all these problems with it. But I really take issue with the fact that defenders of Batman v Superman and these Snyder superfans think that it's a problem with the people who are consuming the product as opposed to the product itself, which is just never true. All right, so that was that one. All right, here's the next one. He's just desperate for clicks. He knows that the Cult of Feig are unfor anyone who doesn't to the MCU line and who think for themselves instead of letting Rotten Tomatoes tell them what to rank. All right, so spelling issues aside, I think I understand what this guy was going for. I'm not part of the Cult of Feig. I definitely think Marvel has had their share of misfires. But for the most part, Marvel has a formula that they stick to that by and large works. They don't do a lot of narrative errors on their good movies. And when they do have problems with their films, they are usually outweighed by the good stuff that they do. At worst, I'd say the worst Marvel movies are probably mediocre, whereas the good ones can be really, really good. Now, I like some DC Comics movies as well, but in particular, Batman v Superman, I felt like had a lot of problems. I'm not going off of the Rotten Tomatoes score to base my opinions on. It's basically, I rewatched this movie, then I rewatched the theatrical cut, I compared the two, I thought about them, I took notes, and I came up with a lot of problems with these things, and I like to think for myself. And the whole purpose of the podcast is to have a discussion about these movies and figure out what works and what doesn't. And it just so happens that a lot of this stuff doesn't work. And it's not in comparison to Marvel films. It's as its own standalone critique of this movie. Ha ha ha. So I gotta believe you know more about writing than Oscar winner writer Chris Terrio. Do you even know the structure the script is following? Pretenders on Twitter are always funny. Well, My answer to this is Akiva Goldsman won an Oscar. He wrote Batman and Robin. Does that make Batman and Robin a good movie? No. Whether or not a writer wins an Academy Award or not does not mean he is a quality writer. It doesn't mean he's a good writer necessarily. It just means that for one single movie, he not only got stuff right, but enough people in the Academy were convinced that he did something that was worthy of winning an award. There are lots of people out there who have won Oscars that didn't deserve them. And there are lots of people out there who won Oscars for, one single good thing they did and then went on to just, crap the bed on every other project that they worked on. So I don't look at Academy Award winners as, being infallible. Now, for Chris Terrio, he won the Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay for Argo. And, it's very easy to write a good movie when you're adapting it from good source material. Because it's basically you take what's on the book and you put it up on the screen and you just change the stuff that needs to be changed for the logistics of your movie. So Chris Terrio winning an Oscar for that, okay, fine, good for him. But if you look at all the movies that he's worked on other than Argo, firstly, Argo is the only movie that he wrote solo, and it was adapting a book. All of his other movies, Batman v Superman, Justice League, this upcoming The Rise of Skywalker, Episode 9 of Star Wars, he's writing it as a co-writer. He's a collaborator. And none of his movies have been very good. And I mean that from a writing perspective. If you like the movie, fine, whatever. But from a tradecraft perspective, as another writer examining another writer's work, his stuff has been less than impressive, let me tell you. And so just because he's an Academy Award winner doesn't preclude him from, being criticized or being analyzed or any of that stuff. So yes, I am not an Academy Award winning writer, but, that doesn't mean that my opinion is invalid, especially when I can look at his work and break it down using proven and tested concepts and methods of writing, storytelling, and filmmaking. And that's what we're going to be doing on the podcast. All those credentials and zero ability to analyze films. So sad. And this is from a response I made to the thread, kind of giving people who asked kind of a background in, my film education. And, I went to film school, graduated with a bachelor's degree in communications. I worked in the film industry for a little while, and I'm a professional writer. So if people don't like what I write, I don't eat. So I have to make sure that it's good and people like to consume it. And, I've been a big fan of movies growing up. I've studied movies all my life. I've studied creative writing. I've studied, English literature. I've studied all this stuff. And, maybe I don't have a, blue check mark by my name on Twitter, but I like to think that I can make a case for my arguments when it comes to analyzing, storytelling and movies and TV shows and stuff like that. So this idea that I have zero ability to analyze a film, I don't necessarily agree with. And I would ask that, in comparison to my background, what's your background in terms of, how it stacks up to mine and how that would invalidate my opinion. So moving on. And this is another impression on my background here, where he says, I have a background in film theory, a bachelor's in filmmaking. I worked in Hollywood, and I'm a professional writer, so I feel like I understand what I'm analyzing. Well, yeah. He was probably on his phone the whole time. Most movies made today are structured to where you can lose focus but get the plot retold to you so you can still follow along. With BVS, you actually have to sit and pay attention like an adult, consuming thought-provoking content. I wasn't on my phone the whole time, and I don't know why you would think that unless you were, spying on me in some fashion. But, I really, made an effort to analyze this movie and pay attention to it. So, the first thing I did was I had the extended edition already on my Amazon account. I sat down, I watched that, and I took notes while I watched it. And I paid attention. Now, keep in mind, I'd seen this movie 3 times beforehand. I'd seen it once in the theaters, and I'd watched the Ultimate Edition twice after buying it. So I wasn't unfamiliar with this movie. Like, I'd paid attention to it before, so I understood it. But this time going in, I was really analyzing it. And then, as soon as the extended edition was finished, I went and bought the theatrical edition just so I could compare the two. And I watched the theatrical edition after I watched the Ultimate edition, and made notes on like what was taken out and what and how that impacted the experience on the film. So yeah, I do have the ability to sit down and pay attention and watch a movie without having to have it spoon-fed to me. And I thank you for not making that type of assumption in the future. You see, from a narrative standpoint, it's unconventional. Not adhering to the basic 3-act structure and linear storytelling isn't a bad thing. I hate to break it to you, but Batman v Superman adheres to the traditional 3-act structure, and it is told in a linear fashion. So, yeah, I don't know quite the point you were trying to make there, but it's completely invalid. Everyone agreeing with Mr. Matthews' meatball-looking ass has the exact same face. Well, I am part Italian, so I'm going to take the meatball-looking ass thing as a compliment. Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate your insightful and welcomed comments. Honestly, I think the same applies with a podcast. I hope you spend more time talking about movies you actually like, and it'd be great if you invited a fan of BVS to share their point of view too. For my Roundtable Review podcast, I basically look at all types of movies, bad movies and good movies. And I actually tend to think that you can learn more from the mistakes of bad movies than you can learn from good movies that do things right, because there's just a lot more to talk about and discuss on this. Now, keep in mind, I don't hate Batman v Superman as a movie. I didn't think it was a good film, but I don't dislike it. There's something entertaining about it that kind of helps you to forgive a lot of its flaws. But overall, I would say that I find movies I dislike much more interesting to study and analyze, because I can figure out what not to do with my own storytelling. And sometimes knowing what not to do is even more important than what you should be doing, because you can always kind of debate on what you should do and try new stuff and not kind of confine yourself to certain things. But it's always a good idea to know what to avoid and what traps to not fall into. And so I think bad movies help with that. Now, in terms of finding a Batman versus Superman fan to come on the podcast and defend it, I do like to get differing opinions on that. I did a podcast recently with Goonies where I specifically sought out someone I knew did not like Goonies and could actually put up a convincing argument as to why he didn't like it. But when it comes to Batman v Superman, I couldn't really find someone whose opinion I trusted enough to come on and defend this movie. And what I mean by that is that, there are plenty of people out there who are Zack Snyder fans and stuff like that, but their argument always comes down to, oh, you're a Marvel shill, or, oh, you don't know a good movie when you see it. They don't actually have any arguments that they can make that stand up under scrutiny. So, like, you can't take established film criticism or established, writing concepts and legitimately argue that, this movie was done correctly. And I did look for them. I just couldn't find any people who I felt were the right fit for my podcast. So what I did instead was I tried to find two guests who I feel are very insightful critics who have a focus on storytelling. And I wanted to bring them on, and we're going to discuss this stuff, and I'm probably going to end up playing devil's advocate a bit with these two, because we all are kind of in agreement on, the quality of this film. But, just in terms of, discussing the movie and figuring it out and figuring out what works and what doesn't, we're going to get down into the nitty-gritty on it. And it's not going to be just about hating this movie. It's going to be about actually sitting down and analyzing it and figuring out what it did right and what it did wrong. You all been discussing this movie for more than 3 full years. A bad movie wouldn't take this long to dissect and expose, right? Well, here's the thing. You can't really put a time limit on movies. Bad movies are discussed just as much as good movies, in the sense that, people over the ages go back and, take a look at these things. Like, how long has Plan 9 from Outer Space been discussed? That's arguably one of the worst movies ever made. And yet, people still talk about it. Tommy Wiseau's The Room another bad movie. People still talk about it. But there are other films that, kind of fit into the bad movie category that people still talk about. So I think that saying like, oh, you're talking about it 3 years later, it must mean it's good. No, it just means that there's so much about the movie that's there to talk about that, there's still interest in going back and revisiting it. I don't look at a time period as a factor in terms of quality. If you really want to get down and dirty about this, you could say that the characters of Batman and Superman have been around for 70 years and people still obsess over them. And so talking about a movie that stars both of them that's only 3 years old, that's just an extension of the obsession surrounding these characters, because I grew up as a fan of Batman. I grew up as a fan of Superman. So the idea that there's just another movie out there that features these guys is just, something where my passions intersect, because it's a movie, which I'm passionate about, and it's got two characters I'm very passionate about, and there's a lot of stuff to be learned from this movie. So, this whole defense that, oh, it's 3 years old, it must be, special because you're still talking about it. No. There are lots of movies that I talk about that are way older than this one, and that doesn't necessarily make them special. For instance, one of my favorite movies is Deep Rising, and this is a terrible movie from the 90s, early 2000s that, I talk about quite a bit because it's just stupidly enjoyable for me. And I admit it's a bad movie. But just the fact that I still talk about it years later, decades later, in fact, doesn't actually mean that it's good. So please keep that in mind in the future. This argument that, oh, you've been talking about it for 3 years, it must be good. No, it's not. The characters who have persisted for close to 80 years, those are what are good. The movie itself has a lot of issues that can be, kind of broken down and dissected. And if you're a film student or something like that, or if you're a student of storytelling, you can go back and revisit this movie time and time again and spot new problems with it that you can break down and avoid. Like in film school, we watched movies that were way older than this one, so just the fact that, it's 3 years old, it doesn't mean anything. Oh, look, another person whining about how they dislike Batman v Superman 3 years after its release. Can y'all move on already? We get it. No, I'm not going to move on. I talk about the movies I want to talk about on my podcast. That's why it's my podcast. And I love the characters of Batman. I love the characters of Superman. I love Wonder Woman. I love the DC universe. I've been a DC comic book fan for a long time. In fact, if you look at those books right behind my big fat bald head, you'll see that a lot of them are DC comic graphic novels. And, one of my favorite comic books growing up was Batman The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller, which was a big influence on this movie. So, I don't think that you can just say like, oh, it's been 3 years, get over it, move on. If I want to talk about a movie, why can't I talk about a movie? It's really that simple. Then don't watch it. Nobody's forcing you. Eye roll emoji. You're right. Nobody was forcing me. I wanted to watch it. And I was watching it because I want to discuss it on my upcoming podcast. There's no rule that says I only have to watch movies that I think are perfect and that I agree with every choice the filmmaker made and that I think the story is fantastic. I actually find the process of watching a movie I dislike and then sitting down and thinking about it and figuring out what it was I disliked and why to be a hobby, to be something that I find enjoyable. So yeah, nobody's forcing me to watch it, but I wanted to. So, get off my case. All right, so here's a little exchange that it's a little bit longer than the other tweets I was showing, but I felt like it was interesting enough to highlight. Basically, @NerdSoupMonkey once said that it was better than Civil War in regards to Batman v Superman. And then I responded, I'd have to disagree with that. Civil War still holds up on repeat viewings, at least for me. And then another person comes in and replies, I feel the complete opposite. I really hated Civil War. It doesn't have anything to say, really, and characters end where they started. BVS is satirical. It's a satirical indictment on the behavior of both political parties in the run-up to the 2016 elections and a call for bipartisanship. To which I replied, okay. And then that same person replies, I think about the context in which the film was released. I think the biggest failing of critical analysis of the film is that nobody talks about what the film is about because it's politically incorrect. Also, people are interested more in ideas than politics. And finally, the last comment here is, stop making sense, man. Don't you see the subtext in the film went over his head? Don't you dare start making him think. So, this idea that Batman v Superman is a hidden allegory for the 2016 elections and a call for bipartisanship, I think that's a bit of a stretch. I mean, first of all, this film was shot in 2015, which was like a year out of before the 2016 elections, and it was developed and written, probably in 2014. So we're talking about 2 years out before Trump got elected. So this idea that, it's actually a political allegory for the 2016 elections and it's meant to, try to get people to come together, where I guess like Superman's the Republicans and Batman's the Democrats and they're fighting, but then like, they got to mend their fences to come together to face the greater evil who's actually Donald Trump or something like that. This is this is headcanon. This is something that you're reading into the movie that isn't actually there. Now, Batman v Superman does have a political subplot into it because Zack Snyder, as a director, wanted to have a realistic take on the DC Universe world. And after the events of Man of Steel, of course, the government would get involved and you'd have senators debating on how to regulate Superman and stuff like that. And so he definitely wanted to have that as part of his movie. But this idea that it's a political allegory for real life, I just don't see it. And I think anyone who does is maybe reading a little bit too much into that. Okay, here's another exchange. Looks like it has too much content for your mind to process. Happens. You have to make sure that you have patience when you watch this movie. Watch similar movies to this which put too much detail on the story arcs and doesn't shy away from controversies. And then you will be ready to... And then the next reply is, true. If he was searching for a piece of entertainment, then this movie was not his piece of cake. And the original poster replied, It hits you with so much info, so much things happening. If I was a critic faux this movie, I would have comic knowledge, movie format knowledge, should know the references, should be able to connect things to Man of Steel. This is a critic's nightmare of an amusement park. So, very well thought out and well written critique there. It seems to be a popular thing to tell people, you're not paying attention and you don't know anything if you think this movie's bad. And, you can disagree with people's critiques and assessments of a movie, but this idea that, you don't know anything if your opinion is different from, the person criticizing it, that just doesn't make any sense to me. You don't need to have a pedigree in filmmaking in order to make legitimate critiques of a piece of art, but it helps. But to assume that I don't have a background in comic book knowledge, as you can see behind me, I got plenty of comic books, and that this is just in my office, like downstairs. I've got entire bookcases full of comics. So I'm familiar with comic books and these characters in the comics over time. I've watched all the DC movies, Man of Steel, all this stuff. So I had a background going into this movie of knowing what the setup was. These assumptions that people are just basically ignorant and therefore they don't understand the movie and can't comprehend it, it's bumpkiss. And I think it really weakens your argument when you assume these things about people. You should assume that people know what they're talking about and then reveal that they don't through debate and making valid points that they can't, negate with. So I would just say that I think that my critique on this movie is pretty well informed, and if you disagree with that, well, feel free to debate me in a well-written and thoughtful way on Twitter, and I will be happy to engage you. All right, guys, so those were some of my favorite hot takes off of this Twitter crap storm that came my way for daring to criticize a movie by the great and powerful Zack Snyder. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I kind of had fun debating all the people who were actually civil and gave out well thought out responses to my tweets. And for the people who were just toxic and mean and vitriolic, well, thanks for paying attention at least. Be sure to check out my podcast. But we're going to be doing a roundtable review podcast on this movie in particular. It probably won't be out until September sometime, because I release these things monthly and it takes me a long time to edit them and get everything together because I'm busy working on new novels and working on the Daily Geekery website and stuff of that nature. But I want to thank you all for watching this movie. If you like my channel, please subscribe, and I will catch you guys later. And also follow me on Twitter if you want to engage in a lot more interesting discussions like the one we just went through. So this is Matt Kadish, and I will catch you guys next time.